The glass didn't just break, it exploded. Angie Coleman flinched even though the memory was a week old. It was a ghost sound, an echo of fury that still haunted the pristine silence of her Midtown Atlanta apartment. She remembered the Waterford crystal tumbler, a gift from one of Keith's business associates, shattering against the Italian marble fireplace. It hadn't been full of whiskey. It had been full of Keith's rage, a sudden terrifying squall that had blown through their perfect world because she'd been 10 minutes late coming home from a solo shopping trip to Lenox Square. He hadn't hit her. He never did. He hit things near her. It was a calculated form of terror, a reminder of the power he held, a promise of what could happen if she ever truly stepped out of line. Her apartment was a gilded cage suspended 30 floors above the sprawling, glittering expanse of Atlanta. From her floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the city breathe, the distant silhouette of Stone Mountain at dawn, the pulsing veins of traffic on the downtown connector at dusk. It was a breathtaking view, paid for in full by a man she was beginning to fear more than she loved. Everything in the two-bedroom apartment was a testament to Keith K.B. Bird's success and his ownership of her. The Eames lounge chair in the corner, the Sub-Zero refrigerator humming quietly in the kitchen, the walk-in closet overflowing with Jimmy Choo shoes and Balenciaga dresses she'd worn only once. They were beautiful things, expensive things, but they felt like anchors, each one weighing her down, chaining her to him. At 24, Angie was a masterpiece of Keith's creation, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that artists can and do discard their old work. She ran a hand through her silk-pressed hair, the morning light catching the fire of the 3-carat diamond on her finger. It wasn't an engagement ring. Keith didn't believe in marriage. He believed in investments, and Angie was his most prized asset. She'd met him 3 years ago at a crowded club in Buckhead. She was a 21-year-old hostess, tired of fending off clumsy advances and counting tips to make rent on her tiny Inman Park apartment. He was 32, exuding a dangerous charisma, his muscular frame draped in a custom suit that probably cost more than her car. He wasn't handsome in a classic sense. His features were hard, his eyes intense and predatory. But he moved with the unshakable confidence of a king in his domain. He'd offered her a way out, a life she'd only seen in magazines. "Quit your job," he'd said. "I'll take care of you." All she had to do was be his. Always available, always beautiful, always obedient. A simple transaction, she'd thought at the time. Now, the simplicity felt like a trap. The silence of the apartment was broken by the buzz of her phone on the nightstand. KB. Her stomach tightened. She let it ring, the vibration a nervous tremor against the polished wood. It rang again, and again. On the 4th call, she answered, schooling her voice into a mask of sleepy contentment. "Morning, baby," she purred. "It's almost noon, Angie." His voice was a low growl, devoid of warmth. It was the voice he used for business. "Where have you been?" "Right here, sleeping in." A lie. She'd been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and desire. He didn't believe her, but he let it go. For now. "Listen up. I need you tonight. We're having dinner with David. Wear the red dress, the one with the low back." David Parker, Keith's partner. The two were a study in contrasts. Keith was the muscle, the raw, intimidating force. David was the brain, smoother, more polished, with a college degree and a way with words that could charm a snake. But Angie had seen the coldness in David's eyes, a calculating intelligence that was, in its own way, even more frightening than Keith's explosive temper. "A business dinner?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Keith rarely included her in actual business. She was an ornament, meant to be displayed at celebrations, not negotiations. Something like that. "It's an important night. A big deal is closing. I want you there. I want you to look good for me, for us." The us felt hollow. It meant him, his status, his power. She was the accessory that proved he could have anything he wanted. "Of course, Keith." "What time?" "I'll pick you up at 8, and Angie." His voice dropped, losing the business tone and gaining a sharp personal edge. "Be ready. Don't make me wait." The line went dead. Angie placed the phone back on the nightstand, her hand trembling slightly. A big deal. That meant money, a lot of it. The thought sparked something in her, a tiny, dangerous idea that had been flickering in the back of her mind for months. She walked back to the window, looking down at the city that was her prison and, just maybe, her key to escape. The life Keith had given her was suffocating, but it had also given her a front-row seat to a world of immense wealth. Wealth that flowed in cash, untraceable and fluid. Money that could buy a new life, a new identity, far away from Atlanta and the man who owned her soul. The dangerous idea began to burn a little brighter. It was reckless. It was insane. It was, she realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity, her only hope. She wasn't just dressing for a man. She was arming herself for a battle. By 7:45 p.m., Angie had transformed. The red dress Keith had requested was a whisper of silk that clung to her curves, a bold slash of color against her deep brown skin. It was a weapon of address designed to command attention, to distract, to disarm. Her makeup was flawless, her hair swept up in an elegant chignon that exposed the graceful line of her neck and the vulnerable expanse of her back. As she spritzed on a final mist of Tom Ford perfume, she met her own eyes in the mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger, a beautiful, poised creature built for display. But behind the calm facade, Angie's heart was a frantic drum, beating out a rhythm of fear and rebellion. Keith arrived precisely at 8, his blacked-out Escalade gliding to a stop in front of her building like a panther. He looked her over, a slow, possessive appraisal that made her feel like a car he was about to purchase. "Perfect," he grunted, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He didn't say she was beautiful. He said she was perfect, as if she were an equation he had solved. The restaurant was an exclusive steakhouse in the heart of Buckhead, a place where old Atlanta money and new, shadier fortunes collided over plates of dry-aged beef and exorbitantly priced wine. The maitre d' greeted Keith by name, leading them past the main dining room to a private alcove shielded by velvet curtains. David Parker was already there, nursing a glass of bourbon. He stood as they entered, his smile warmer and more genuine than Keith's. He was tall and lean, wearing a tailored suit that spoke of quiet expense rather than loud branding. "Angie," David said, taking her hand and brushing his lips against her knuckles. "You look absolutely radiant. Keith, you're a lucky man." His gaze lingered a moment too long, a subtle challenge that did not go unnoticed by Keith, whose jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She cleans up nice, don't she?" Keith said, pulling out a chair for Angie and sitting so close their thighs touched, a clear marking of territory. The dinner was a masterclass in coded language. They spoke of shipments, units, and distribution channels. Angie, trained to be silent and decorative, listened intently. The pieces she gathered painted a staggering picture. A massive consignment of cocaine was arriving from a Colombian cartel, funneled through Miami. This was the largest deal of their careers, one that would elevate them from major players in the Atlanta scene to veritable kings. "The product is A-grade," David said, swirling his bourbon. "Our new friends up north are going to pay top dollar. They're desperate for this quality." "These white-bread boys from Philly," Keith scoffed, a smirk on his face. "They think we're just some dumb street hustlers from the South. They see a couple of black guys in expensive suits and assume we're all flash and no substance." "Let them," David added smoothly, a cold glint in his eye. "Their arrogance is our advantage. They underestimate our logistics, our network. They won't see the real play until we're counting their money." This was a familiar refrain. Angie had heard them talk like this before. A bitter, sharp-edged pride in outsmarting a system they felt was rigged against them. They weaponized the racism they faced, turning stereotypes into camouflage. They were invisible in plain sight, their ambition and ruthlessness hidden behind a mask of what others expected to see. "Everything is set for Friday," Keith confirmed, leaning forward. "The transfer, the storage. It all has to be flawless. There's no room for error, not on this one." He glanced at Angie, a silent warning in his eyes. She smiled sweetly, taking a delicate sip of her wine, playing her part. But inside, her mind was racing. Storage. The word echoed in her head. Where do you hide millions of dollars in cash? Not in a bank. It had to be somewhere close, somewhere secure, a place only they knew. The drive home was thick with a tense, triumphant energy. The deal was done. The machine was in motion. As Keith pulled up to her building, he cut the engine. The silence in the car was heavy. "You looked good tonight," he said, his voice low. David likes you." "He was very polite," Angie replied carefully. "He's always polite. That's his thing." Keith turned to face her, his hand resting on her knee, his thumb drawing slow, deliberate circles. "You understand what you heard tonight, Angie. It's just noise, words. You don't need to know what they mean." "I know," she whispered. His grip tightened slightly, a subtle reminder of the glass against the fireplace. "Good, because you're just a pretty box, Angie. A beautiful, expensive box that I keep all my best things in." He leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't ever try to see what's inside. You won't like what you find." He kissed her then, a hard, proprietary kiss that tasted of whiskey and power. It wasn't a kiss of affection. It was a brand. As she walked away from the car and into the sterile luxury of her building, his words echoed in her mind. A pretty box. He was wrong. A box was meant to be opened, and she was going to find out exactly what was inside. Fear was a currency, and Angie's account was nearly overdrawn. 2 days after the dinner, the weight of Keith's final words pressed down on her, suffocating her. She needed to breathe. She needed an ally. She needed Liza. Liza Turner was Angie's anchor to a world she'd left behind. They had met waitressing at that same club where Angie had been discovered by Keith. While Angie had taken the seemingly easy path, Liza had taken the hard one. She was in her final year of nursing school at Georgia State, working 2 jobs to pay her tuition, her life a whirlwind of textbooks, clinical rotations, and exhaustion. They met at a small, unassuming coffee shop in the old 4th Ward, a world away from the glitz of Buckhead. The air smelled of roasted beans and ambition, not money. Liza took one look at Angie's face as she sat down and sighed. "Okay, what did he do now?" she asked, stirring her latte. Liza's gaze was sharp and missed nothing. She could see the faint, ghost-like shadow of a bruise on Angie's wrist where Keith had gripped her too tightly after she'd flirted with David. "It's not what he did," Angie said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "It's what's about to happen." She leaned across the small table, her eyes darting around the cafe. "Liza, he's closing a deal, a huge one. I was there. They were talking about millions." Liza's expression hardened. "Angie, we've talked about this. You need to get away from him. This business of his is going to get you killed or put in jail." "That's what I'm trying to do," Angie's voice cracked. "This is my chance, my only chance." "A chance for what? To end up in a ditch?" "No, a chance to be free." The words tumbled out of her in a frantic rush. "To start over. I want what you have, Liza. A real life, a future that I own. I have this idea for a boutique, a high-end vintage store. I could do it, I have the eye for it, but I have nothing. No money, no degree, no resume." Keith made sure of that. "All I have is what he gives me." Liza set her cup down, her face a mixture of pity and alarm. "What are you talking about, Angie? What chance?" Angie took a deep breath. "I'm going to take some of the money." The silence that followed was deafening. Liza stared at her as if she'd just confessed to wanting to wrestle an alligator. "Are you out of your damn mind?" she finally hissed, her voice low and furious. "Steal from Keith Bird? From a drug dealer? He breaks fingers over bad math, Angie. What do you think he'll do to you?" "He won't know it's me. He won't even know it's gone. Not at first. We're talking about millions in cash. What's 100,000 to him? A rounding error. I'll take just enough to disappear, to go somewhere else, change my name, and start that life." "There is no somewhere else with men like him," Liza argued, her hands clenched into fists on the table. "Their reach is long. And you're forgetting about David Parker. You think he's any better? He's just quieter about his cruelty." The mention of David sparked a new, even more perilous branch of Angie's plan. She hadn't dared to voice it yet, not even to herself. "They have to be storing the money somewhere," Angie pressed on, ignoring Liza's warning. "A safe, probably, in his house. But I don't know how to get in. I don't know the combination." "Then it's a stupid dead-end plan. Forget about it," Liza pleaded. But Angie's mind was already turning, the gears of desperation grinding away. She thought of the dinner, of the way David had looked at her. It wasn't just appreciation. There was a flicker of something else, a covetousness that mirrored Keith's but was wrapped in a more sophisticated package. Keith saw her as property. David, she suspected, saw her as a prize to be won. And she could use that. "David!" Angie said slowly, a new resolve hardening her voice. He's the key. Liza's eyes widened in horror. Oh no. No, you don't. Don't you dare drag him into this. You're playing two violent, possessive men against each other. That's not a game, Angie. That's a suicide mission. David thinks Keith underestimates him, Angie reasoned, more to herself than to Liza. I can see it. He's smarter, more careful. He resents being the number two. Maybe he'd be willing to betray Keith for the right price. And you think you're the right price? Liza asked, her voice laced with disbelief. I have to be, Angie said, her gaze distant. I have to find out where they're keeping it. I need the combination, and I think David is the only one who will tell me. Liza leaned back, running a hand over her tired face. She looked at her friend, this beautiful broken woman, who was about to walk into the lion's den covered in steak sauce. This will not end well, Angie, she whispered, her voice heavy with prophecy. Greed is a poison, and you're about to drink a whole bottle of it. Angie shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It's not greed, Liza, it's survival. But as she looked at her friend's terrified face, a cold sliver of doubt pierced her resolve. Was there even a difference anymore? Tonight, the bait had to look more appealing than any prize. Angie chose her armor carefully. A sleek midnight blue dress that was more suggestion than statement, paired with heels that made her legs look impossibly long. She was a silhouette of temptation, a walking, talking embodiment of a very bad idea. She met Keith and David at a dimly lit, high-end lounge in Buckhead, the kind of place with $100 cocktails and secrets whispered over the smooth jazz quartet in the corner. Keith was in a celebratory mood, the deal now less than 48 hours from completion. He was loud, expansive, holding court at their corner table, while David watched with his usual detached amusement. This was Angie's opening. She knew Keith's ego required an audience, and he'd soon be engrossed in telling war stories to some of his lieutenants who had joined them. You've been quiet tonight. David's smooth voice cut through the haze of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. He had moved to the seat next to her while Keith was laughing with his crew. Just taking it all in, Angie smiled, turning to give him her full attention. It's all very impressive. It's a business of high stakes and high rewards, David said, his eyes scanning her face. But Keith only sees the rewards. He sometimes forgets the stakes. It was a small crack in the facade of their partnership, and Angie wedged her crowbar right in. He seems very confident, she said, her voice a soft purr. He trusts you completely, doesn't he? To handle the important details, the security. David's smile was thin. He trusts me to make him money. Trust is a different commodity. I know what you mean, Angie sighed, feigning a vulnerability she didn't feel. Sometimes I feel like I'm just a possession. He tells me nothing. I bet you know all his secrets, like where he's going to keep all that money. It must be exciting, being on the inside. She let her hand brush his on the leather banquette. A spark of static electricity, or maybe just pure nerve. David's gaze sharpened. He was no fool. He knew she was fishing, but her performance was good, her beauty intoxicating. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in our world, Angie. So is being underestimated, she countered, looking him directly in the eye. You know that better than anyone, don't you? That hit its mark. A flicker of something, resentment, surprise, crossed his face before being replaced by a wry grin. He was intrigued. He thought this was a game, a flirtatious power play. He didn't realize the stakes were life and death. Keith's predictable, he finally conceded, his voice barely a whisper. He's sentimental, the safe in his study. The combination is his mother's birthday, March 12th, 1968, 031268. He thinks it's clever. He thinks no one would ever guess. 031268. The numbers burned themselves into her brain. She had it. She had the key. She felt a dizzying surge of triumph, so potent it almost made her careless. And you, she pressed, emboldened, where do you keep your secrets? I'm not as sentimental as Keith, he said, his smile turning predatory. But maybe one day, I'll show you. It was at that exact moment that Keith turned back, his jovial mood evaporating as he saw their intimacy. He saw Angie's hand near David's, saw the conspiratorial lean of their bodies. His eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. "Am I interrupting something?" Keith's voice sliced through the air, low and menacing. "Just making conversation," David said smoothly, leaning back without a hint of panic. "Angie was just saying how impressive the operation is." "Is that so?" Keith's gaze fell on Angie, and it was like being pinned by an insect collector. "You suddenly interested in my business?" "He was just being nice, Keith," Angie said, trying to keep her voice steady. The rest of the evening was an exercise in tension. Keith said little, drinking his whiskey in brooding silence, his eyes darting between Angie and David. The air crackled with suspicion. When they finally left, Keith's hand clamped around Angie's upper arm in the parking garage, his fingers digging into her bicep. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, shoving her against the cold concrete wall of the garage. "Nothing. We were just talking." "Don't you lie to me." His face was inches from hers, his breath hot with alcohol. "I saw you." Leaning in, touching his hand. "What did you ask him? What did he tell you?" "He told me nothing," she cried, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "You're paranoid." "Don't you ever take me for a fool, Angie," he snarled, his grip tightening until she whimpered in pain. "You belong to me, not him, not anyone else. You forget that again, and I'll give you a reminder you won't ever forget." He released her abruptly, leaving her gasping against the wall. He straightened his suit, the mask of the calm businessman snapping back into place. "Get in the car." The ride home was silent and terrifying. He dropped her off without a word. Inside her apartment, she locked and bolted the door, her body trembling uncontrollably. She stripped off the blue dress and saw the dark, angry fingerprints blooming on her skin. It was a brand of a different kind. Looking at the bruise in the mirror, her fear didn't break her. It forged her resolve into something as hard and cold as steel. He had given her a reminder, all right. A reminder of why she had to go through with this. A reminder that staying was no longer an option. The silence in Keith's house wasn't peaceful. It was hungry. It was a waiting, listening silence that seemed to absorb the sound of Angie's own frantic heartbeat. Saturday night. The city outside was alive, but in this sprawling, sterile mansion in a gated Sandy Springs community, time had stopped. Leaving the club had been terrifyingly easy. Keith, already 3 sheets to the wind and surrounded by his sycophantic crew, had barely grunted when she'd told him her lie. "Liza's car broke down. She's stranded. I have to go get her. I'll be back in an hour, tops." He had waved a dismissive hand, too drunk and too arrogant to question her. She'd called Liza from the Uber, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. "I'm going in," she'd whispered into the phone. "Call the police if you don't hear from me in 30 minutes. Just tell them you were worried. Don't say why." "Angie, please, don't do this." Liza's voice was a desperate frayed thread. "I have to. 30 minutes. She hung up before Liza could argue further. Now standing in the marble-floored foyer of Keith's house, the key she'd swiped from his jacket pocket feeling like a hot coal in her palm. The finality of her decision crashed down on her. The house was a monument to his ego. It was vast, impersonal, and decorated with the cold precision of a hotel lobby. There were no family photos, no personal trinkets, just expensive art and designer furniture arranged in perfect lifeless vignettes. It wasn't a home. It was a warehouse for a wealthy man's possessions. She moved quickly, her heels clicking like a metronome of dread on the hardwood floors. She knew where to go. The study. A large mahogany-paneled room dominated by a massive desk and a wall of unread books. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the large, abstract painting above the fireplace, a chaotic splash of reds and blacks that mirrored the turmoil in Keith's soul. She pulled the painting aside. There it was, a dull, gray, digital safe embedded in the wall. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the keypad. Her mind went blank for a terrifying second. What was it? The numbers. The key to her freedom. Then it came back to her. David's voice in the smoky haze of the bar. His mother's birthday. Oh, the 31268. She took a shaky breath and typed 031268. A soft click echoed in the silent room, a sound louder than a gunshot. The heavy door of the safe swung open. Angie's breath hitched. She had seen money before, but nothing like this. It was a dragon's hoard. Stacks of $100 bills, neatly bundled and wrapped, filled every inch of the safe. It was an obscene amount of money, more than she could comprehend. It smelled faintly of ink and the cold, metallic scent of the safe itself. This was it, the source of Keith's power, the price of her soul. For a moment, she just stared, mesmerized and terrified. This was real. This was happening. Shaking herself from the stupor, she unzipped the large, empty tote bag she'd brought. Her plan was to take what she'd told Liza, 100,000, maybe a little more, enough to vanish. But seeing it all there, the sheer volume of it, a venomous greed began to whisper in her ear. Why not more? Why not take a whole duffel bag full? He deserved it, for the fear, for the bruises, for turning her into an object. She began grabbing stacks, her movements frantic, shoving them into her bag. 1 bundle, 2, 5, 10. The bag grew heavy. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. Just a little more. 1 more stack. That's when she heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a subtle shift in the house's atmosphere. A soft, almost imperceptible creak of a floorboard from the hallway, just outside the study door. Angie froze, her hand hovering over a stack of bills. Every muscle in her body went rigid. The silence rushed back in, now filled with a new, menacing presence. It couldn't be Keith. He was at the club, drunk and distracted. A security guard? The house had a state-of-the-art system, but she had disarmed it with the code Keith had once drunkenly bragged about. She held her breath, straining to listen. There was nothing, just the low hum of the air conditioning. Had she imagined it? Was her paranoia finally making her hear things? She slowly reached for another stack of money, her eyes glued to the open doorway of the study. Then, a shadow fell across the threshold. It wasn't the devil she expected. It was the other one. David Parker stood in the doorway, his form silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He wasn't angry or surprised. His face was a mask of calm, cold disappointment, as if he'd caught a trusted employee with their hand in the petty cash drawer. He held a phone in his hand, its screen glowing. He'd probably tracked her here. "Hello, Angie," he said, his voice soft. Yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. Angie's blood ran cold. The bag of money fell from her numb fingers, landing with a soft thud on the plush rug. "David," she stammered, her mind scrambling for a lie, an explanation, anything. It's not what it looks like." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Isn't it? It looks like you're robbing us, Angie. It looks like you played me for a fool to get the combination, and now you're helping yourself to the fruits of our labor. My labor. No, I was just..." The words died in her throat. There was no lie big enough to cover this. "You were just... what? Borrowing it?" He took another step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. They were devoid of the flirtatious warmth she'd seen at the bar, replaced by the chillingly detached gaze of a predator. "Keith and I have risked our lives, our freedom, for years to build this. And you thought you could just walk in here and take it?" Desperation clawed at her. Reason. She had to try reason. "He was going to leave me, David, sooner or later. He would have found someone younger, prettier, and thrown me out with nothing. This was my only way out. So you decided to steal from us?" A new tactic. Seduction. It was all she had left. She took a tentative step toward him, letting her fear morph into a desperate allure. "Not from us, David. From him," she whispered, her voice husky. "I told you he underestimates you. He takes you for granted, but I see you. I always have." She was close enough now to touch him. She placed a trembling hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his expensive shirt. "We could leave, together. With this money, we could go anywhere, be anyone. Just you and me. You said it yourself. You're not as sentimental as he is." For a fleeting second, she saw something flicker in his eyes. A moment of calculation, of consideration. He looked from her face down to the bag of money, then back again. He was weighing the options, the possibilities, the fantasy of it, the beautiful woman, the fortune, the ultimate betrayal of the man who held him back, was a potent cocktail. But then his expression hardened, the flicker of temptation extinguished by a colder, more practical reality. "You're a good actress, Angie," he said, his voice flat. He gently removed her hand from his chest. "But not that good? You think I'd trade a multi-million-dollar enterprise that I helped build for a fantasy with a woman who would betray me just as easily as you betrayed him?" His hand moved, not to embrace her, but to the small of his back. He pulled out a sleek black semi-automatic pistol. It looked like a natural extension of his hand. "David, no," she gasped, stumbling backward. "Please, I'll put it back. I'll put it all back, I swear. We can forget this ever happened." "It's too late for that," he said, his voice laced with a chilling finality. "Keith can't abide betrayal. It's the one rule. And leaving a witness who knows I was here, who knows I gave you the code, that's just bad business." Panic, pure and primal, seized her. There was no more reasoning, no more seduction, only survival. She screamed and lunged, not at him, but to the side, grabbing a heavy brass lamp from the desk. She swung it wildly in his direction, forcing him to step back. It was the opening she needed. She didn't run for the door he was blocking. She ran for the window. It was a desperate, hopeless act. They were on the ground floor, but the window was large. Maybe she could break it, scramble through, scream for help in this quiet, wealthy neighborhood. She put her head down and sprinted the few feet across the room. A single deafening gunshot roared through the study. The impact felt like being hit by a freight train. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in her back, stealing her breath, her strength, her future. Her legs buckled beneath her. The world tilted, the mahogany walls and expensive art blurring into a meaningless swirl of color. She crashed to the floor, the plush fibers of the rug soft against her cheek. She heard his footsteps approach. He stood over her, a dark shape eclipsing the light. She tried to say something, to plead, to curse him, but only a wet, gurgling sound escaped her lips. The last thing she saw before the world faded to black was David Parker's face, impassive and calm, looking down at her, not with hatred or remorse, but with the detached, emotionless expression of a man who had just finished a messy but necessary piece of business. Death had a smell, a sterile mix of copper and regret. Detective Brian Miles knew it well. At 52, with 25 years in the Atlanta Police Department, most of them in homicide, he was a connoisseur of the city's tragedies. He stepped out of his unmarked Crown Victoria into the flashing red and blue lights that painted the manicured lawns of Sandy Springs in garish, frantic strokes. It was 2 a.m., the hour of bad news. "What have we got, Miller?" he asked a young, fresh-faced patrol officer standing guard at the yellow tape. "Looks like a domestic gone wrong, detective," the officer said, a little too eagerly. "Victim's a black female, mid-20s, single GSW to the back. Boyfriend's inside, name's Keith Bird. He's the homeowner. The partner, David Parker, is the one who called it in. Says he found her." Miles grunted, pushing past the tape. He hated assumptions. Domestic gone wrong was a neat little box people used to file away the messy, unpredictable violence of human relationships. But things were rarely that simple. Inside, the house was a chaos of controlled activity. Forensics techs in white booties dusted for prints, while a medical examiner knelt beside the body in the study. Miles took in the scene with a practiced eye. The victim, Angie Coleman, lay face down, the vibrant red of her dress a stark, horrific contrast to the pale beige rug, the overturned brass lamp, the open, empty safe behind the abstract painting, the discarded tote bag. It told a story, but he wasn't sure it was the one Officer Miller had written. He walked over to the body. "Time of death, Doc?" The ME, a weary woman named Chen, looked up. "Body's still warm. Lividity is minimal. I'd put it between 10 and 11 p.m. Single shot, looks like a 45. Entry wound in the lower back. No exit. We'll find the slug during the autopsy. 3 to 4 hours ago." Miles made a mental note. He knelt, careful not to disturb anything, his eyes scanning the floor. That's when he saw it. Near the large window on the far side of the room, almost hidden by the heavy drapery, was a small, fresh scratch on the polished hardwood floor. It was straight and deep, as if something metal had been dragged across it. It didn't fit with the narrative of a simple shooting. It was a dissonant note in the symphony of the crime scene. He stood up and made his way to the living room, where 2 men sat on a cream-colored sofa, looking lost amidst the opulence. One was big, powerfully built, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. He reeked of expensive whiskey and grief. Keith Bird. The other was leaner, impeccably dressed, his face a mask of controlled shock. David Parker. "Detective Miles, homicide," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I need to ask you what happened here." "What happened?" Keith's voice was a raw, broken rasp. He shot to his feet, swaying slightly. "You're asking me what happened? My girl is dead upstairs. You should be out there finding the son of a bitch who did this, not asking me stupid questions." "We will, Mr. Bird," Miles said calmly, used to the rage of the bereaved. "But first I need to know your timeline. Mr. Parker, you made the call?" David nodded, his composure a stark contrast to Keith's. "Yes, detective. Keith and I were at a club, the Blue Room. I left a little after 1 a.m. to head home. I decided to swing by here to discuss something with Keith for tomorrow. The front door was ajar. I thought it was strange, so I came in. I called out, but no one answered. I went upstairs to the study, and I found her." His voice was steady, but Miles could see the tension in his jaw. "Angie was with you at the club?" Miles asked Keith. "Yeah," Keith mumbled, sinking back onto the sofa. "She came around 9, left around 10:30, maybe 11. Said her friend Liza's car broke down. She was going to help her." "And what was in the safe?" Miles asked, turning his gaze back to David. Keith and David exchanged a look so fleeting, Miles would have missed it if he hadn't been watching for it. "Some cash," Keith answered after a beat. "Jewelry, maybe $50,000-$60,000, emergency funds." Miles knew he was lying. You don't get a safe like that for 60 grand. You get it for a hell of a lot more. "And who knew the combination?" "Just me," Keith said firmly. "Nobody else." "That's true," David added. Keith was always paranoid about security. Miles's eyes drifted back to the study, to the scratch on the floor, to the story that wasn't quite adding up. He had 2 men, partners in some unnamed business. One was hysterical, the other unnervingly calm, a dead girlfriend, an empty safe, and a lie about how much money was missing. This wasn't a simple domestic. This was something dirtier, something with roots that went far deeper than a lover's quarrel. The night was young, and the lies were just beginning. Grief was a lock, and guilt was the only key. Detective Miles found Liza Turner in a small, tidy apartment near the Georgia State campus at 4 in the morning. When she opened the door, her face was already pale, her eyes wide with a sleepless terror that told Miles she already knew something was terribly wrong. "It's about Angie, isn't it?" she whispered before he could even show his badge. In her small living room, surrounded by stacks of nursing textbooks and anatomy charts, the story of Angie's gilded life and desperate end came tumbling out. At first, Liza was hesitant, her words clipped, her fear of Keith Bird a palpable thing in the room. But when Miles told her, gently, that Angie was dead, the dam of her fear broke, and a torrent of guilt and grief poured out. "I told her not to do it," she sobbed, her body racked with tremors. "Oh God, I knew this would happen. I told her." "Told her not to do what, Ms. Turner?" Miles asked, his pen poised over his notepad. "The money," she choked out. "She was going to steal the money, from the deal. She said it was millions. She said it was her only way out." Miles listened, his expression unchanging, as Liza recounted everything. The dinner with David, the coded talk of a huge drug shipment, Angie's growing desperation, and the insane, reckless plan to rob her own boyfriend. "She was so unhappy," Liza continued, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He treated her like a doll, something to show off. He controlled every part of her life. But she was scared to leave with nothing. He made her dependent on him. She thought the money would set her free." This filled in a huge blank. The empty safe wasn't a simple robbery. It was the motive. The whole damn thing was about the money. "She called me," Liza said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Around 10:45 p.m., she said she was going into the house. She was supposed to call me back in 30 minutes. She never did." Liza's face crumpled. "I should have called the police then. I was so scared of Keith. I just kept calling her phone over and over. It just went to voicemail." "You did the right thing telling me now," Miles reassured her. "This is important. How did she plan to get into the safe? Mr. Bird claims only he knew the combination." Liza hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. This was the most dangerous part. This was implicating someone else. "It was David," she finally said. "Angie told me. She flirted with him, played on his ego. He's the one who told her the combination. He told her it was Keith's mother's birthday. Miles's pen stopped moving. Bingo, that was the piece that connected the dots. David's calm demeanor, his rehearsed story about finding the body. It was all a lie. He wasn't just a witness, he was a participant. He had armed her with the key to the treasure chest. Did Angie say anything else about David? Miles pressed. About his relationship with Keith? Liza thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. She said he was the smart one, the careful one. She said David was tired of being in Keith's shadow. Oh, and she said something else, something strange. What was it? She said that David bragged about being smarter than Keith, that he had his own hiding spots, places, and accounts that Keith knew nothing about. She thought maybe she could use that, convince him to betray Keith and run away with her. His own hiding spots? The phrase stuck with Miles, a man with secrets from his own partner, a man who was playing his own game. The interview with Liza had transformed the case. It was no longer a simple question of who pulled the trigger. It was a complex web of betrayal, greed, and lies. Angie had tried to play two deadly predators against each other, and they had turned on her. Miles had Keith, the enraged boyfriend, and David, the cool, calculating partner who'd given her the means to her own destruction. One of them was a killer, and thanks to Liza, Miles now suspected the one who appeared the calmest was, by far, the most dangerous. He thanked the distraught young woman and left her with her grief and textbooks, heading back into the city's dark heart with a much clearer picture of the truth. An alibi is a story, and every story has a plot hole if you look hard enough. Detective Miles spent the next 24 hours trying to tear down the stories his two main suspects had built. Keith Bird's alibi was infuriatingly ironclad. He had stayed at the Blue Room until David's frantic call came in around 1:30 a.m. Multiple witnesses, including the bartender and several of his own crew, confirmed it. More than that, Keith had gotten progressively drunker and more agitated as the night wore on. Around midnight, he had made a scene, trying to call Angie repeatedly, his voice growing louder and more belligerent with each call that went to voicemail. He was a possessive, potentially violent man. But on the night Angie was murdered, between 10 and 11 p.m., he had been in a public place, surrounded by people. He couldn't have pulled the trigger. That left David Parker. Miles brought him into an interrogation room at APD headquarters. The room was small, gray, and designed to make people uncomfortable, but David Parker seemed immune to it. He sat at the metal table, his hands loosely clasped, looking more like a concerned citizen than a murder suspect. "We've been reviewing the timeline, Mr. Parker," Miles began, his voice casual, "and we have a few questions." "Of course, Detective. Anything I can do to help find who did this to Angie," David said, his tone pitch-perfect with sincerity. "You told me you left the club a little after 1 a.m., Miles said, leaning forward. "But the club's security footage tells a different story. It shows you leaving at 10:38 p.m., roughly 15 minutes after Angie Coleman walked out. For the first time, a flicker of something. A brief flash of panic crossed David's face before his mask of composure snapped back into place. "Ah, yes, I'd forgotten. I left to take a business call. It was sensitive. I needed some privacy. I walked around the block for a while, then came back to the club later." It was a plausible lie, but it was also a 90-minute hole in his alibi, right during the ME's window for the time of death. "A 90-minute phone call?" Miles raised an eyebrow. "It was a complicated negotiation," David said smoothly. "With whom?" "I'm afraid I can't disclose that, Detective. Client confidentiality." Miles let the silence hang in the air. "Liza Turner says you gave Angie the combination to the safe." "The girl is mistaken," David said, shaking his head with an air of pity. "She's grieving? Probably confused. Why would I do that? It was my money in that safe too. Maybe you had a change of heart. Maybe you followed Angie to the house. Maybe you confronted her, and things got out of hand." Miles pushed, watching for a reaction. David didn't flinch. "Detective, are you accusing me of murdering Angie? That's an outrageous suggestion. I was her friend. I was trying to help Keith build a life for her. He was good. He was very, very good. He was cool, logical, and unshakable. Miles had no weapon, no physical evidence tying David to the scene. The preliminary forensics report had come back inconclusive. The study was clean of any prints that didn't belong to Keith or Angie. The killer had been careful. Without the murder weapon or the stolen money, David's weak alibi was all he had. And it wasn't enough for an arrest, let alone a conviction. Miles ended the interview frustrated. David Parker walked out of the police station a free man, his tailored suit unwrinkled, his composure intact. As Miles watched him go, he felt a gnawing certainty that he had just let a killer walk out his door. The case was stalling. The trail was going cold. Keith was a dead end. David was a stone wall. He needed something more. He needed to find a crack not just in the alibi, but in the crime scene itself. His mind went back to the strange scratch on the floor and Liza's words, his own hiding spots. A man that careful, that meticulous, wouldn't just make the money disappear. He would have a plan. He would have a spot, and Miles was going to find it. Sometimes the most honest witness has 4 legs and a cold nose. 2 days after his frustrating interview with David, Detective Miles was hitting a wall. The case had gone cold. David Parker was back to his life. A ghost Miles couldn't touch. Keith Bird was holed up in a hotel, drowning his grief and paranoia in bourbon. The stolen money had vanished. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. Sitting at his desk, staring at the murder board, Miles's eyes kept snagging on 2 details: the unexplained scratch on the floor of the study, and Liza Turner's words, his own hiding spots. A man with secret stashes is a man who plans ahead. David's story was that he'd shown up hours after the murder. But what if he'd been there? And what if he had to move something? Something heavy enough to scratch a floor? It was a long shot, a gut feeling, but it was all he had. "Get me a warrant for another search of Bird's property," Miles barked at a junior detective. "And get me the K9 unit. I want a currency dog." The next morning, Miles stood on the manicured lawn of Keith's mansion, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and unspoken violence. Beside him stood Officer Hansen, a lean, wiry K9 handler, and Rocco, a magnificent German shepherd whose intelligent eyes missed nothing. Rocco was a currency dog, trained to sniff out the specific inks and materials used in U.S. currency, even in small amounts. "The house has been cleaned by a professional crew Keith hired," Hansen warned. "The scent trail inside will be faint, if it exists at all." "I'm not interested in the house," Miles said, his eyes scanning the expansive, meticulously landscaped backyard. "Let's see what Rocco finds out here." Hansen gave the command, and Rocco went to work. The dog was a blur of focused energy, crisscrossing the lawn in a grid pattern, his nose twitching, taking in a world of smells invisible to the humans. He bypassed the pool, the ornate gazebo, the perfectly trimmed hedges. He seemed uninterested in the house itself. Then, Rocco's demeanor changed. He became laser-focused on a section of the yard near the back fence, where a small ornamental Japanese maple stood, its delicate red leaves a splash of color against the green. The dog began to whine, circling the tree, his tail rigid. Then he sat, looked back at Hansen, and let out a single sharp bark. The signal. He'd found something. Miles's heart began to beat a little faster. He signaled to the 2 uniformed officers with him, who came over with shovels. Under the shade of the maple tree, they began to dig. The soil was looser here than in the surrounding area, a clear sign it had been recently disturbed. About 2 feet down, a shovel hit something hard with a dull thud. Carefully, they cleared the remaining dirt away. It was a waterproof Pelican case, the kind used for expensive camera equipment. It wasn't the large duffel bag of money Angie had been filling. This was something else, something personal, something hidden. A forensics tech pried open the latches. Miles leaned in, his breath catching in his throat. Inside was not the mountain of cash from Keith's safe. It was a smaller, more curated collection, about $80,000 in bundled hundreds, and nestled beside it, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a .38 caliber revolver. Miles stared at the contents. This wasn't the murder weapon. The ME was sure the slug was a .45. This wasn't all the stolen money. This was David's secret stash. This was the money he had been systematically skimming from Keith for months, maybe years. The scratch on the floor? David hadn't been dragging a body. He'd been dragging this case out of its original hiding spot inside the house to bury it outside, using the chaos of the murder as cover. Angie hadn't just stumbled into a robbery. She had stumbled into the middle of a much longer, colder betrayal. David hadn't just killed her to stop her from stealing their money. He had killed her to protect his own, and in his greed and arrogance he had left behind the one piece of evidence that would burn his entire world to the ground. Miles looked at Rocco, who was now getting a well-deserved ear scratch from Hanson. "Good boy," Miles said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "You just blew this case wide open. A man can build a fortress of lies, but it only takes one stone to bring it down. David Parker's stone was a .38 caliber revolver, and $80,000 he shouldn't have had." When Miles walked into the interrogation room for the third and final time, he didn't bring questions. He brought the Pelican case and placed it on the metal table between them. He opened it slowly, letting David see the contents, the money, the gun, his secret. David stared at the case, and for the first time since this ordeal began, his mask of unbreakable composure shattered. His face went slack, the color draining from it, leaving behind a pasty gray fear. He understood, in that instant, that the game was over. "This isn't about Angie anymore, is it, David?" Miles said, his voice quiet. "This is about your own private retirement fund, the money you've been skimming from your partner for God knows how long. Angie just had the bad luck of trying to rob a bank you were already robbing." David didn't answer. He just stared at the gun. His gun. "Here's what I think happened," Miles continued, laying out the truth like a hand of cards. "You gave Angie the combination, thinking she might cause a little trouble for Keith, maybe create a diversion. But you followed her, not just to stop her, but to make sure she didn't find your stash, which you probably had hidden somewhere in that study. When you confronted her, it wasn't just about protecting the partnership's money. It was about protecting your own betrayal. You killed her to silence her. Then, in the chaos, you moved your case from inside the house to a new spot in the backyard, thinking no one would ever look there. You called the police, played the part of the shocked friend, ready to let Keith take the heat if it came to that." David finally looked up, his eyes hollow, defeated. The smooth, intelligent businessman was gone, replaced by a common killer caught in his own trap. "She shouldn't have been there," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It was all getting too complicated. She was a loose end." "So you tied her up," Miles finished for him. "Miles, you say." David Parker confessed to everything: the long-term embezzlement, the manipulation of Angie, the murder, and the cover-up. He had killed her not in a moment of passion or panic, but with the same cold calculation he applied to his business dealings. She was a liability, and he had liquidated her. The dominoes fell quickly after that. David was charged with first-degree murder and a litany of other felonies. His confession and the discovery of his secret stash led investigators to unravel his and Keith's entire drug operation. Keith Bird, his empire crumbled, his girlfriend dead, and his partner revealed as a traitor and a killer, was arrested and faced federal drug trafficking charges. He lost everything. A few weeks later, Detective Miles stood in the back of a small church, watching the sparse collection of mourners at Angie Coleman's funeral. He saw Liza Turner in the front pew, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. He thought about the tragic, tangled web of choices that had led them all here. Angie had wanted freedom, but she'd sought it through a shortcut paved with greed, and it had led her to a dead end. Keith had built a kingdom on violence and fear, only to have it destroyed from within by the one person he thought he could trust. And David, the smartest man in the room, had let his ambition and avarice consume his humanity, trading his soul for a stash of money he would never get to spend. As he walked back to his car, the gray Atlanta sky threatening rain, Miles thought about the lesson buried beneath the tragedy. It was an old one, a simple one he'd seen play out 100 times in 100 different ways on the city's brutal streets. There is no easy path. The relentless pursuit of wealth without work, of power without principle, is not a ladder to success, but a spiral into a self-made hell. It's a trap that promises everything, but ultimately takes it all, leaving behind only wreckage, regret, and the ghosts of what might have been. Far away, in a quiet library on the Georgia State campus, Liza Turner underlined a passage in her nursing textbook, her focus absolute. She was building her future one page, one exam, one honest day's work at a time. She was choosing the hard way, the only way that truly leads to freedom.